Peter was a faithful disciple of Jesus. After Jesus died on the cross, he and the other disciples were initially despondent. But then Jesus rose from the dead. Despair turned to joy, and Peter and the others became more committed than ever to following Jesus, no matter the cost. Some weeks after Jesus rose from the dead, he ascended to heaven, where he even now ministers on our behalf in heaven, interceding for us. But before he left earth, Jesus instructed his followers to preach the gospel, the good news, to all peoples in all the world. Peter himself faithfully did so. But as a reward for faithfully preaching the gospel, he found himself in prison. Not long before, King Herod Agrippa I had killed one of the other original 12 disciples, James, the brother of John. Would Peter be next? While Peter was kept in prison, the church prayed fervently for him. Then it happened. Peter was asleep, bound in chains, surrounded by 2 guards, with more by the door keeping watch. Then suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He tapped Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his wrists. Then Peter followed the angel out of prison. What an amazing answer to prayer. Yet what about James and others who were not delivered? Not long before he was crucified, Jesus withdrew to pray, as he often did. This time he withdrew in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was greatly distressed and agitated, and he was deeply grieved, even to the point of death. He instructed his disciples to pray that they may not come into the time of trial. Then he moved a little way off, fell on his face, and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." If it is possible, how could anything not be possible for God? In Gethsemane, according to Mark, Jesus also prayed, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible." So on one hand, he prayed, "If it is possible," while on the other hand, he prayed that for the Father, all things are possible. What is going on here? Taking these verses together, we see that it must be that in some sense, all things are possible for God. But in another sense, even for God, some outcomes might not be possible. For example, outcomes that would require God to break his promises or otherwise act contrary to his perfect nature. Here, Christ prayed specifically to be spared from the suffering and death before him if it were possible. Could Christ have avoided the cross? Yes, he could have chosen to do so. But could he have done so and still saved sinners? No. It wasn't possible if God was to keep his commitment to save sinners while remaining perfectly just. Christ's words, "if it is possible," then, indicate that some avenues are not available to God in keeping with his commitments and his goals. In this case, God could not bring about his greater desire of saving humans apart from Jesus enduring the cross for us. Accordingly, Christ not only prayed, "If it is possible, let this cup pass," but he added, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Later in Gethsemane, Christ prayed again, 2 different times, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." This is the same phrase that Christ instructed his followers to pray in the Lord's Prayer. So in the midst of the greatest crisis, Jesus practiced what he preached. If you wish to follow Christ's teaching and practice, he invites you to also pray, "Your will be done." But while doing so, understanding God's will to correspond to the most preferable way forward that is possible, given all the factors, seen and unseen. Praying for God's will to be done, then, is consistent with wrestling and striving with God in prayer, as Jesus himself does here. This way of praying, however, sometimes lends itself to misunderstanding, particularly to misunderstandings about God's will and about God's character. Think for a moment of a young girl who hears people praying for the healing of her mother. Her mother is deathly ill with what has been diagnosed as terminal cancer. "Father," they pray, "if it is your will, please heal this woman. Yet not our will, but yours be done. When the little girl hears this kind of prayer, what is she to think? Why would it not be God's will to heal my mommy? Does God want my mommy to suffer and die? Doesn't God love me and my mommy and want what is good for us? It's not difficult to see how such a prayer, though theologically sound, could lead to misunderstanding. Here it helps to make a simple but profound distinction found in the Bible between what God prefers or ideally wills, that is, what would take place if everyone only did what God prefers, and what I call God's remedial will, which is God's will that takes into account the free decisions of others, including all the bad ones. And then God brings about what is best given all the available avenues. If we understand this distinction, we can pray for someone to be spared from death with the confidence that such a prayer is in accordance with God's ideal will. It is the outcome God prefers in and of itself. But at the same time, we might also recognize that His remedial will might take another course due to many other factors that are not strictly up to God, many of which may be unseen from our perspective. Understanding this, we can and we should follow Christ's example. We should also pray not only that God's will be done, but also, if it is possible, let this cup pass. And in doing so, we should keep in mind that some avenues are not morally available to God in light of other factors, many of which are unseen to us. To pray like Jesus with the words, if it is possible, then, is to pray if it is possible in keeping with what is both available and preferable given everything God knows about all the other factors involved, seen and unseen. That is, if it is possible in keeping with God's remedial will. In this way, we might pray for God to answer our prayers in the most preferable way possible, which might not align with what we have in mind. While praying this way, we can consistently and confidently affirm that God ideally wants to heal every suffering person. But in many cases, that avenue might not be available or preferable due to the factors in the cosmic conflict that might be invisible to us. There are far more factors involved relative to God's action and apparent inaction than we could fathom. Among other things, Christ's teaching and example demonstrates that we can consistently pray to God for His intervention, while at the same time affirming that God knows what is most preferable in any situation, truly wants to bring about what is most preferable in every situation, and is always entirely good and loving. Accordingly, we might fervently pray for God's intervention, even perhaps crying out that we feel forsaken as Jesus Himself cried out on the cross, while nevertheless trusting in God's constant, unwavering goodness, justice, and love.